welcome to Grandma B's Busy Life. I'm Brenda. Today we are going to be making cinnamon raisin bread, and I am going to do it a little bit differently than I normally do. Normally I fast forward through some of the parts, or I cut parts out that aren't as interesting as I think they should be, but today I'm going to actually do it in real time. I'm going to let you watch the entire mixing process, because I think that's the hardest part about making bread, is knowing when do I add more flour, when do I let it mix, when is it done. So this video is going to be a little longer than usual, but what I'm going to do is put in the description box all of the timestamps. So if you want to skip past the mixing part and get to where I'm actually making the cinnamon raisin portion of it, feel free to do that. So let's jump right into getting it made. The first step is to make your yeast mixture. You start with 1.5 cups of warm water. You don't want it hot, just warm, and 1 teaspoon of yeast, and just mix it up and let that sit until it's nice and foamy like this. All right, into the mixer you will put your yeast, and then this recipe calls for 3 cups of flour. And I like to put in about 2 3/4 cups to start with. I live in the desert, so I know that I'm going to use at least 3 cups and sometimes more depending on the time of the year. So I just dump 2 3/4 cups in right off the bat just to get started. If you live in a more humid area, then you can put less flour in. Here's where I noticed that I was going too fast. So if you live in a more humid area, you may want to start with a little less flour. The key to this, though, is that you really give it enough time to mix. I think the biggest mistake, or maybe the most common mistake I made when I was new to making bread, was adding flour too quickly. Now in the beginning it's okay, as long as you don't add too much in the beginning. But you want to, in the end, take your time. So here I'm adding 1 teaspoon of salt. You want to wait until after you put some of the flour in to put the salt in, because when the salt and the yeast come in direct contact, the salt can kill the yeast, and you definitely don't want to kill your yeast or you won't get any rise on your bread. So this is mixing, and it looks like right now when you're looking down into the bowl that there's way too much flour in there, because the ball of dough is in the middle and the flour's on the outside. But it's really not yet too much flour. It just needs to absorb. It takes the flour some time to really absorb all of that moisture. So here's where I realized my arm was in the way, so I switched to my left hand, which is a little awkward, but it works. I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. So I've got it all mixed up. I'm just trying to lift up that flour and get it all coated on the outside of that ball of dough so that it'll start to absorb. And as it starts to stir, it looks like it's all in one ball, but give it some time. That flour will start to absorb, and then we'll be able to tell if we need to add more flour. There's a couple things you're watching for. You're watching for the dough to pull away from the side after all of the flour's been absorbed into the ball of dough, or for the dough to start flattening out and sticking to the sides and becoming one kind of mass at the bottom. Right now there's this piece at the bottom that's not connected to the ball. I call that the pancake. I know that's not what it's called, but that's what I call it. And it does eventually get incorporated. So you see how this dough is starting to flatten out, stick to the sides, and no longer be formed into a ball? This is an indication that I need to add more flour. Now, I want to caution you about adding flour. You definitely do not want to add too much too fast. I like to start by adding about a tablespoon at a time and letting that fully mix in before I add more in. So here I add about a tablespoon, and I just wait and let it mix. And at first, when you first add extra flour in, it often looks like you've added way too much. but you've just got to give it time to fully incorporate, to either form a ball or to flatten back out. When it gets looking like this, I know I need to stir it down. Now my mixer is a pretty big mixer, so one loaf of bread is just sits at the bottom. Mostly you can see that it's only hitting the bottom of my dough hook. But if you have a smaller mixer, then it might not sit at the bottom like this. But just scrape down the sides, get that flour all over the outside of the dough again, and turn it back on, and it'll continue to mix. But you do need to scrape it down occasionally. I don't worry too much about all of the stuff on the side. I give it a little scrape and then turn it back on. Now it is in a ball again, and that's just because the flour has coated the entire outside of the dough. But as it starts to absorb, again, it will either flatten out or it will stay into the ball. But I know it's not ready at this point because there's still flour on the bottom that hasn't been incorporated. And just as that flour gets incorporated, you see it starts to flatten out again and stick to the sides, and it's no longer in one big ball. So that's the indication to me that I need to add another tablespoon of flour. Are you mesmerized by mixing dough? I could sit and watch my mixer spin and spin and spin. I don't know why I'm so fascinated with it, but I love it. Okay, so now what's happening is this dough is pulling apart and kind of making chunks. And then again, I'm getting that pancake like on the bottom and then chunks on top. And at this point, you might think, oh no, I've ruined it. It's all falling apart. It was all stuck together and now it's falling apart. Nope, you haven't ruined it. Just keep going. That flour really just takes time to mix in. So I just keep letting it go until it either flattens out or forms a ball. I'm sounding like I'm repeating myself. Maybe I am. All right, I can see that it's really sticky on the bottom, but I am starting to get a ball on the hook, which is good. That means I'm getting close, but it is really still stuck to the bottom and it's spreading out on the bottom. So I can tell I'm getting close, but it definitely still needs more flour. So I'm going to put in another tablespoon and let that mix in. And I want to remind you, if you don't want to watch all of this mixing, you can definitely go into the description box and find the timestamp and fast forward to where I turn it into cinnamon raisin bread. So I just added another tablespoon of flour. The reason you add the flour very slowly is because it's so easy to over add the flour. And if you do, then you get a very dense loaf of bread and it doesn't rise the way it's supposed to. And I don't know about you, but I like light and fluffy bread. Okay, here we have again the pancake and the ball of dough, but just give it time. The dough will either pick up that pancake and put it and incorporate, or it will all flatten back out. What's happening is the glutens in the flour are strengthening and developing, and as they develop, they become more stretchy and they have more structure, which means they'll stick together better. So letting it mix like this gives it that structure. And I could see that it was still really sticky to the bottom, so I added another tablespoon. And you know, in my climate, I really could probably start with 3 cups of flour, but I have added too much flour too many times early in my bread making that I learned it's better to take time. See how this is kind of separated into 2 separate balls? When I was new at making bread, I thought, oh no, I've ruined it again, because it looks almost too dry. But if you just give it time, one of 2 things will happen. You know, right? It'll either form a ball or it'll flatten out. Now, do you see on the right side, near the bottom there, it was pulling apart from the bowl, and you could see a little bit of silver showing on the left too. That's telling me I'm getting even closer. It's not quite there because it's still quite sticky on the bottom, but I'm getting really, really close. So I'm going to add at least another tablespoon here. Right now I'm just getting my bowl ready. I put a little bit of oil in the bottom of the bowl that I'm going to rise it in. The reason you put oil in the bottom of the bowl is so that when you put the dough in and it starts to rise, it'll slide up the side of the bowl really easily and it doesn't fight to rise. So looking down in the bottom of that bowl, I can see quite a bit of silver. So I know I'm getting really close and those glutens are really building up. But you see there on the right how it just kind of started to stick to the bowl and now it's starting to spread out again? It does need more flour. Right here I'm testing it to see, and when I pull it, do you see how it's stuck to my finger? It's not quite ready. It needs a little more flour. You want it to be tacky, but not sticky. So when I touch it, it should feel tacky, but I shouldn't pull pieces of dough off on my finger. So I knew it wasn't quite ready. And here goes another tablespoon or so. I don't measure. I just do whatever, a little bit in at a time. Again, this looks like I've ruined it. It's falling apart in pieces. Just be patient. And watch what happens as this flour, at this stage, this is when I start to get excited because I know I'm getting really, really close. It'll start to pick up that pancake off the bottom and pull it into the dough that's on the hook. And you'll start to see pieces of the side of the bowl exposed as it picks up that dough. Can you see on the left there? We're seeing quite a bit of the bowl there. And it'll continue to pick up pieces. It's much more mesmerizing in person than it is on video, but I just wanted you to be able to see that it's what's happening in the bowl there. It's pulling away from the bowl. Why does it do this? Well, because it's the right consistency. But the other thing is that those glutens have developed. Look how much of the bowl you can see now at this point. It's looking really, really good. Now it's still slightly sticking at the bottom, but I want to wait at this point. When you see it starting to pull away from the bowl, don't add any more flour because as the glutens develop, it's going to get smoother and smoother and it'll stay into this ball form like this. Really the indication to me that I'm done adding flour is that it's formed that ball and only a tiny bit of it is stuck to the bottom. And then I just need to give it time and let it mix for a while. So, I'm just putting my dishes in the dishwasher while I wait and I just hang out and wait. This takes anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes. It'll take longer if you mixed flour in quickly and it didn't take a lot of extra, or it'll take less time if it took you a long time to add in the flour because it needs to mix for about 10 minutes total, and it took me quite a while to get the first bit of flour mixed in. Well, it took me quite a while to get all of the flour mixed in. So it's already mixed for almost 10 minutes. But once it's fully incorporated and it's pulling away from the sides like this, I want it to mix for at least about 3 more minutes. This is a basic bread dough. This is the recipe I use for my regular white bread. I make pull-aparts, breadsticks, pizza. I do lots of different things with this dough. So if you wanted to use this dough for any of those things, you would follow all of the directions I've shown you so far. The only thing you do different in the end is just not add cinnamon and raisins and put it into the loaf pan just like I do with the cinnamon raisin bread. You just wouldn't add cinnamon and raisins. Okay, so now I'm going to test it and see. And when I pull on it, can you see it's still sticking to my fingers? So it's not quite ready. It does not need more flour. It just needs more mixing time so that those glutens can develop. I know it doesn't need any more flour because it's not sticking to the bowl. So I'm just going to give it a little more time to mix. I'm just going to clean up around the kitchen a little bit and give it some time. Do you see I came up with another spoonful of flour and I looked at it and went, Brenda, you know better. Don't add more flour. It's tempting. It's tempting because I know it's sticky, but give it some time. It will develop those gluten so it's not as sticky. Okay, I think we're getting really close here, and I'm going to give it a test and see how it's looking now. It's amazing how just 1 or 2 more minutes of mixing really help those glutens develop. Look how clean the bottom of that bowl is. The only reason the sides are not clean is because they got um, dried on early on in the process. Now watch as I pull on it, you'll see that now it's not sticking to my fingers. It's still a little tacky, but it's not sticking to my fingers, so it's ready. So now I'm just going to scrape it off the hook and get it ready for the bowl. Remember, I've already sprayed the bowl, so it's ready to go. And it does scrape off the hook pretty easily because it's at that right consistency. So this is my greased bowl. And when I dump it into the bowl, I just scrape the bottom. It does peel off really easily. It is sticking, but it's not gluey. It's more like Play-Doh sticking, I guess. I don't know how to describe it. But it just comes out in one big ball. And then I just fold over. Oh, see, look how clean it came out. It shows you that it was ready. So I just fold over the sides so that the oil that's on the bowl gets on the outside of the dough, just so that there's oil on all of it. And then I just flip it over. And I cover it with a bandana. Now these are bandanas that I only use in the kitchen. I don't use them for anything else. But I put a little bit of hot water on them and then wring it out and then just lay it over the top of the dough. The reason I use wet bandanas is that it keeps the moisture in so that the top of the dough doesn't dry out. If the top dries out, it'll quit rising. So I just cover it up and let it sit for about an hour, depending on how warm your kitchen is. Okay, this rose for about an hour, and you can see that it's doubled. And I love this part. Look how it just peels right off the bowl. Now this is the perfect time to flatten it out because it's full of air, so it's really stretchy. So I just stretch it out and press all the bubbles out, or most of the bubbles out. And I don't measure, but I just sprinkle some cinnamon on it because I'm going to mix it into the dough. And then I have raisins that I've been soaking in hot water. If your raisins are too dry, then they don't mix into the dough as well. So I soak them in a little hot water before I add them on. Now notice this is a tiny pile of raisins. It was sadly not enough raisins. It was one of those little tiny boxes, and it really should have been 2 or 3 times that many raisins. But I didn't think about it at this point. So I'm just mixing the cinnamon and the raisins in. I always mix my cinnamon into my dough, sticking to my mat there, but I like to mix the cinnamon into the dough so that that cinnamon flavor goes all the way through it. And I also explain a little bit later why I don't like to roll it up like a cinnamon roll. So hang on to the end and I'll explain that in a few minutes. But I just mix it with my hands. What I'm doing here is just kneading it in my hands. You can knead it on the board also. I like to knead with my hands. Basically what I'm doing is I pull with my thumbs and tuck under with my fingers, and then pull and tuck and pull and tuck, and that mixes the dough really well together. At this point I realize I need to spray my mat so that I can knead it by hand against the countertop. So I'm just going to spray the mat so that I can do some kneading on the mat. What I'm going to do is just I push. First, I'm going to put more cinnamon on it, and then I fold and push and fold and push, and that helps get the cinnamon in. I like it marbled, but if you want to put this back in your mixer and mix it until the cinnamon is completely evenly distributed through the whole loaf, you can do that. It just depends on what you want. I think it's pretty marbled and I like the way it looks, but flavor-wise, it doesn't change much unless you really want the cinnamon evenly distributed. This is a plenty good method. Okay, so now I'm going to get ready to form it into a loaf. And I'm doing that same method. I'm pulling with my thumbs, tucking under with my hands, with my fingers. And I'm wanting to get a nice smooth top on the dough. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to make it a little longer so that it'll fit into my loaf pan. So I'm pulling, tucking, and pulling and tucking. I think right here I'm picking up all the cinnamon and raisin that's fallen onto the mat there. All right, now I'm making the loaf, you can see, and I'm pinching the bottom to hold it together, making sure those raisins stick in there good. Pulling it around, tucking it under. Now it's in a loaf shape. I sprayed my loaf pan with just a little bit of cooking spray. I'm going to stick it in there, and I just flatten it out a little bit so it's even. And then I'm going to use that same bandana, and I did re-wet it so that it's damp, and then cover it up and leave it. And again, it's about 45 minutes to an hour to rise. After 45 minutes, it was risen above the edge of the pan, and it's not a huge rise above, but it is up over the top of the pan. So I put in the oven at 350 degrees, and it takes anywhere from 25 to 35 minutes. You know it's done when it's golden on top, and when you tap on it, it sounds hollow. So you can see that after baking, it is another inch or so above the pan. It does rise more as it's baking. I did butter the top and then just left it on the rack to cool. All right, let's try it. Okay, so here's a slice. So let me tell you right off the bat something I would do. I would put in more raisins. I put one of those little boxes of raisins in. I think I would put in 2 or 3. There was just nowhere near enough raisins. And I think the cinnamon amount is right. As you can see, it's marbled in there. If you want to mix it in better, you can definitely do that. But I'm just going to rip off a chunk and taste it. Homemade bread is always delicious, but that cinnamon in there is really, really good. Again, it needs more raisins, but overall, really good. I do like to mix the cinnamon into the bread rather than rolling it like a cinnamon roll, because when you roll it like a cinnamon roll, when you slice it, it falls apart. But when it's like this makes really good French toast. It also is really good toasted with some butter and cinnamon sugar on top. Lots of ways you can use it. It's also, I love cinnamon raisin bread, but you can make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches from it. It's super good, especially if you use grape jelly. Thank you for sticking around to the end and watching me as I make bread. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you again soon.